So, hello. This is the first mini lecture in managerial economics. And what I want to do here is just explain what managerial economics is, explain what it is that we're going to be doing in the course as a whole. So this is just a quick introductory mini lecture. So managerial economics is an advanced microeconomics course. So probably if you took undergraduate economics, you took two courses. You took a microeconomics course and a macroeconomics course. And the microeconomics course was the one that's the analysis of specific markets. So if you took a standard microeconomics course, the kind of thing that's typically taught in say Eco 101 type things, the topics you cover things like supply and demand. You might cover something on public goods and externalities. You might cover something on firms' production decisions. So this isn't an analysis of the entire economy. It's just an analysis of little bits of the economy. Macroeconomics is the other course, so maybe this was your Eco 102 type course, and macroeconomics is an analysis of the whole economy, so it covers other topics. It covers things like inflation and GDP and aggregate supply and demand. So you're looking at the economy as a whole rather than at specific markets. The goal of this course is to provide you with microeconomic tools. So this is the analysis of specific markets, and the goal is to provide you with tools that will help you make decisions as managers of private firms and that will allow you to think about public policies towards business. So this is kind of different than a typical intro microeconomics course. In an intro microeconomics course, it's kind of taught from the viewpoint of a public policy type viewpoint. So you might have learned about minimum wages, for example. And for this, rather than focusing on the policy side of things, we'll be focusing more on the firm side of things. So we're talking about the decisions of firms rather than from a policymaker viewpoint. So to do this, we have several goals. One is we want to be able to solve algebraic, calculus, graphical, and game theory problems in economics. We want to explain how demand is estimated. We want to apply microeconomic tools to real-world problems. So the kind of tools we give you, we want to say how you would apply them to real-world problems as a firm manager would. To do this, we want to describe the economic theory of the firm, how economists think about firms, and then we want to describe how market structure affects firms' decisions. The final thing we'll do is we'll explain how policymakers correct market failures. So market structure is what the market looks like, what other firms are in the market, what the product looks like, these kind of things, and how these affect firms' decisions. And we want to focus not generally on market failures. We want to talk specifically about market failures related to firms, and so we'll be talking about dealing with monopolies and oligopolies, and this fits into understanding how the market structure of these works. So to give you an example, let's talk about a case. So this is a famous case. This was from 2014. Comcast was the largest pay TV provider in the United States. It had $26.7 million. Time Warner Cable was the fourth largest pay TV provider, and it had 11.4 million customers. Now there are other TV providers who are also large, DirecTV for example, and so these aren't the only cable companies, but for pay TV they were big players, especially Comcast. And what Comcast wanted to do basically was to buy Time Warner. If it had done this, then the combined two firms, they would have had about 30% of pay TV customers in 2014 and about 40% of broadband internet customers. So a lot of people get their broadband internet through their cable company. So in February 2014, what Comcast did was it announced that it was planning to buy Time Warner Cable. And the cable and broadband market is kind of an interesting market to analyze because of the structure of the market. There's basically a few very large firms in the market: Comcast, DirecTV, Time Warner Cable, and so this is an example of an oligopoly. And when you analyze oligopolies, you want to analyze them differently than you would want to analyze very competitive markets. And so we'll talk about oligopolies and we'll talk about the other market structures later in this course. This is one of our goals that we talked about earlier, is to analyze market structures. So why did the companies want to merge? And this relates to the economists' view of the firm. And the simplest answer for an economist is that the economists thought it would increase profits. And it's going to affect a lot of other things. They're going to have more customers. They're going to have greater market share. They'll have more revenue. They might have lower costs, and this is a debate that was talked about when regulators were talking about the merger. But ultimately, it's the profits that economists think drive decisions. So only profits really matter for what firms do. These other things, getting more customers, getting greater market share, getting more revenues, lowering costs, these can matter too, but only as far as they affect profits. If just becoming bigger isn't good for a firm if it's not going to increase the firm's profits. So we're going to talk a lot about profit maximization and how firms would do that. It's going to be one of the first topics of the course. So how did we expect it to affect costs? And we'll talk about costs in general, but the idea is that the industry has a lot of high fixed costs, or what we call large economies of scale. And that means when they merged, they thought they could save a lot of money. So rather than having, for example, two marketing divisions, they'd only need one. And this is one of Comcast's arguments, that the newer firm would be more efficient, it would waste less money, and so we could combine all these things like marketing and research and development, and this will allow them to cut costs. Costs are one of the things that are most important for market structure, the level of competition in the market. So we'll talk about the other determinants of market structure and costs later in the course as well. Now, another thing that other people feared, not the companies, of course, themselves, they feared that if you combine the two companies, that the two companies would be able to raise prices. There'd be less competition, and one thing we'll talk about is that firms that are monopolies and firms that are small oligopolies can tend to charge higher prices than would be charged in a competitive market. So in this case, the combined firm was going to have a greater market share than previous companies, and so in general we'd expect prices to be higher in these concentrated markets. So another thing we'll talk about is how competition affects prices when we talk about market structure. And we'll also talk about other things that determine prices, and in particular this will bring us to the law of demand. Finally, they thought it would might have an effect on concentration. So this is back to the point, reducing the number of firms in an industry, it tends to decrease competition and result in higher prices. So this goes back to our theory of market structure. But to do this, we really need to be clear about what the market is. So what Time Warner said is, yes, if you look at just cable companies, then we're very, very large cable companies, but we're not just competing with cable TV. And the second thing that they argued, interestingly, was that they don't really compete with each other. Although Comcast and Time Warner were both very large cable companies, most cities only have one cable company in the city. So where I used to live in Arlington, Virginia, it was just Comcast. So Time Warner wasn't really a competitor for Comcast because you couldn't get Time Warner cable in Arlington. In 2014, I think Time Warner in Laredo, the city where Tammy U is was a Time Warner company, and it's changed its name now. But there was no Comcast competing with it, and it turned out that very, very few customers have a choice of Comcast or Time Warner. So what Time Warner and Comcast said is, we're not really competing with each other in this way. They also said that in high-speed internet we have lots of other competitors. We need to compete with smartphone networks, which are getting bigger and more important. We have to compete with DSL, which is provided by phone companies and by other phone company surveys. And what the competitors argued, the other firms in these two businesses argued, is they said, well, DSL and smartphones aren't really competitors for high-speed internet, especially at that time. So it's important to know how to measure market concentration. So we are going to talk about measuring market concentration when we talk about market structure in the firms. The final thing about this is that when you get large firms wanting to move, the large firms can't just decide to merge. Any merger has to be approved by the FCC before it goes ahead, so the Federal Communication Corporation. So the FCC has to decide whether the merger is in the public interest. A second department that can review it is the Department of Justice. They can also review any of these, any large mergers. And what the Department of Justice said after Time Warner and Comcast announced they were going to merge is the Department of Justice said it would prepare an antitrust lawsuit. It said, we think that if you merge, you're going to end up charging higher prices to your consumers, and we don't want that to happen. So right after the Department of Justice said they were going to prepare an antitrust lawsuit, Comcast announced it was calling off the merger. The reason for this is kind of interesting. It doesn't necessarily mean that Comcast thought they were going to lose the lawsuit. They thought they would probably win it, although what they thought was it's going to take a long time to resolve this. So if you ever watch antitrust lawsuits, they typically take 5-6 years, and so by the time that came down the road, 5-6 years from now, it wasn't clear that this merger was going to be a good idea anymore if you have to wait that long to do it. And so they decided it would just make the deal too difficult, and they didn't want it hanging up other things that they wanted to do in the meantime. Time Warner Cable did eventually merge with another cable company called Charter, and that was approved by FCC in April 2016. So the Comcast merger was disapproved because Comcast was too large and it was buying Time Warner, which was too large as well. On the other hand, Charter was a much smaller company, and so they allowed the merger of two smaller companies. So we're going to talk about the inefficiency of monopolies and oligopolies. This is why the regulators wanted to get involved in this in the first place, and we'll talk about how governments manage them later in the course. Now, the merger, as well as affecting the two companies that are merging, is going to affect other companies in the market, and lots of other firms filed briefs opposing or supporting the merger. So one network that opposed the merger was the Dish Network, and this is a competitor for cable, so it's one of the satellite TV companies. And so this is a competitor for cable, and they didn't want to be competing against this larger firm. They thought it would make their lives more difficult. Another firm that interestingly opposed the merger was Netflix. Now Netflix kind of competes with cable companies in a way, in that in that it's providing a service that could substitute for cable, but they were more worried about the broadband internet side of things. That is, they need cable to deliver services to their customers, and most people with high-speed internet get it through cable. If the cable companies could somehow block Netflix, they were worried that a combined company would be able to slow its internet services, and this could affect competition in the long run. So we're going to talk a lot more about these kind of strategic issues later towards the end of the course, and that's when we talk about game theory. Game